At my granddaughter wedding, I discovered that I was the unwanted guest. They would pay dearly for that slight. My own daughter didn't want me at my granddaughter's wedding. The words still cut like broken glass inside my chest. My name is Eleanor. I'm 68 years old, and I believed I knew the meaning of family. I thought that after a lifetime dedicated to my children and grandchildren, I would be welcomed with open arms wherever they were. I had never been so wrong. It all started with the invitation to Melissa's wedding, my only granddaughter. When the envelope arrived, 3 weeks after all the other guests had received theirs, I thought it was just a problem with the mail. The invitation seemed rushed, without the handwritten name like the others I had seen on Melissa's friends' social media. Still, I was so happy to be included that I ignored the signs. I prepared weeks in advance. I bought a new dress, a soft blue shade that matched the wedding theme. I had a pearl necklace made to give to Melissa, pearls that belonged to my mother and that I had kept for decades for this special moment. I saved for 6 months to give the newlyweds a generous check, even with my modest teacher's retirement. On the wedding day, I arrived early. The hall was stunning, with white flowers cascading from the ceiling and twinkling lights that transformed everything into a fairy tale setting. Melissa always wanted a wedding like this, and Catherine, my daughter, certainly made sure everything was perfect. Her husband, Richard, a successful corporate lawyer, spared no expense. I looked for my name on the escort cards table, those small cards that indicate where each guest should sit. I went through the entire wall of cards organized in alphabetical order: Hamilton, Harper, Hendricks. Nothing with Holmes, my last name. Confused, I asked one of the organizers, "Holmes?" "Let me check," she said, consulting her list. Her face subtly changed. "Ah, here it is. You're at table 27. When I found table 27, my heart sank. It was the table furthest from the main hall practically, hidden behind a decorative column, so far from the central stage that I could barely see Melissa during the ceremony. I looked at the other names placed at the table: the family's former gardener, the hairdresser who attended Catherine a few times, Richard's father's driver, people who clearly weren't part of the inner circle, people who were invited out of by obligation, not desire. "Grandma, you came?" Melissa's voice sounded behind me. I turned to hug her, beautiful in her wedding dress. "Of course I came, dear. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Melissa looked at the table where I was assigned, and I saw something in her eyes. Embarrassment? Discomfort? Before she quickly looked away. "Is everything okay with your seat?" Mom organized the seating and... "It's great," I lied, forcing a smile. "Don't worry about me." She seemed relieved by my response and was soon called by someone to take photos. "I have to go, Grandma. See you later, okay?" The following hours were an exercise in invisibility. No one came to talk to me beyond the other obligatory guests at table 27. From my position, I could see Catherine circulating among the important guests, laughing and posing for photos. Richard followed her, proud in his expensive tuxedo. It was like watching a movie where I had no role. During dinner, I needed to go to the bathroom. On the way back, I passed by the small office that was being used as a storage room for gifts. And purses. The door was ajar, and I heard voices. Catherine and one of her friends. "Still can't believe you placed her so far away," said the friend, her voice slightly intoxicated by champagne. What was I supposed to do? Put her at the main table so she could embarrass everyone with those old stories? You know how she is. Besides, Richard wanted to impress the partners at the firm, and honestly, she doesn't match the aesthetic we've created. But she's your mother, Kathy. And I invited her, didn't I? Believe me, it was a battle with Richard. He thought we could simply not invite her, but I explained it would be too much drama. This way is better. She's technically here, but she doesn't interfere. And in the photos? The photographer has instructions. Just a few with her, and separate from the main album. The room started spinning around me. My own daughter was talking about me as if I were some kind of embarrassment, a burden, an unwanted obligation. I felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces as my legs trembled under the weight of this revelation. I returned to table 27 on autopilot, my face a carefully composed mask to hide the inner storm. Catherine's words echoed in my ears, mixing with memories. Sleepless nights when she was sick, years working 2 jobs to pay for her education, unconditional support when she became pregnant with Melissa while still in college. I realized then, with painful clarity, that I had fallen into the category of the undesirables. I was the guest they had to tolerate, not celebrate. The weight of this revelation was almost unbearable. When dinner ended and the band started playing, I remained seated, observing. Catherine danced with Richard, then with his father. Melissa twirled in the arms of her new husband, radiant and happy. No one looked in my direction. No one noticed when I picked up my purse and stood up. I left the generous check I had prepared on the gift table. I placed the box with the pearl necklace beside it, a family treasure that now seemed as out of place as I was. With one last look at the bright hall where my family celebrated without me, I quietly walked out through the side door. As I drove home, alone in the darkness, something changed inside me. The tears dried before they even fell. In their place emerged a cold, clear resolution. I would never allow myself to be treated like this again. If they saw me as dispensable, then I would be exactly that, absent. For years, I put my family above everything, sacrificing my dreams, my time, my well-being. And this was my reward, being hidden behind a column, excluded from official memories, spoken of as an inconvenience. No, this would not stand. This humiliation would be the last. When I got home that night, I didn't cry as they would expect a rejected grandmother to do. Instead, I began to plan. If they wanted to exclude me from the family album, I would rewrite the entire story. That night after the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my small living room, surrounded by framed photographs that now seemed like artifacts from a parallel universe where I mattered to my family. I picked up one picture, Catherine at her high school graduation, her smile bright with promise. As I stood proudly beside her, I remembered the 3 jobs I worked that year to afford her college application fees. My house was quiet save for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to my late husband, Edward. He'd been gone 15 years now. 15 years of navigating life's challenges alone, of being both mother and father to Catherine, of being the only grandparent Melissa had ever known. Edward died when Catherine was just 19, his heart giving out without warning one ordinary Tuesday morning. He collapsed at the breakfast table, coffee still warm in his mug. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. Just like that, my partner of 23 years vanished from our lives. We had modest savings and a small life insurance policy, but it wasn't enough. Catherine was in her 2nd year at Briarwood College, an expensive private institution she'd had her heart set on since childhood. Edward and I had promised her we'd make it happen, no matter what. With him gone, that promise fell to me alone. I sold our family car first, opting for bus routes and occasional rides from neighbors. Then I picked up evening shifts at the local diner in addition to my daytime teaching job. On weekends, I typed up legal documents for a law firm downtown, mind-numbing work that I'd do until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned. 3 jobs, little sleep, and a persistent ache in my chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. This became my life. "Mom, you don't have to do this," Catherine had said during one of her visits home, finding me asleep at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. "I can transfer to state. It's much cheaper." "No," I'd insisted. "Your father wanted this for you. We planned for this. Nothing has changed." But everything had changed. I just didn't want her dreams to be another casualty of Edward's death. I remembered the day Catherine met Richard during her final year at Briarwood. He came from money, old money as they say. His father owned a prestigious law firm. His mother was on the board of several charities, and his childhood home had its own name, Oak Ridge Manor. He was handsome, ambitious, and utterly enchanted by my daughter. When Catherine brought him home to meet me, I saw how she looked at our modest three-bedroom house with new eyes that had grown accustomed to marble foyers and crystal chandeliers. I watched her straighten the faded throw pillows and apologize for the creaky floor in the hallway. "Your home is quaint, Mrs. Holmes," Richard had said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he surveyed our living room. "Catherine has told me so much about growing up here. I served them my best pot roast on the good china that I'd kept for special occasions." Catherine barely touched her food. Later, I overheard her in the kitchen with Richard. "It's just temporary," she'd whispered. "Once I graduate, we won't have to come here often." The memory stung fresh as I sat there alone after the wedding. I set the graduation photo down and picked up another, Melissa as a newborn in my arms. Catherine had called me in tears from her apartment near campus during her senior year. "Mom, I'm pregnant," she'd sobbed. "Richard's parents will disown him if they find out. His father has his whole career planned, and it doesn't include a baby. I don't know what to do." I drove to her that same night, 3 hours on dark roads with rain pelting the windshield of the used car I'd finally been able to afford. When I arrived, she fell into my arms, her body shaking with fear. "We'll figure this out," I'd promised. "Together?" And we did. I took a leave of absence from teaching to help Catherine through her pregnancy. I was there in the delivery room when Melissa entered the world, her tiny cries filling the space as Catherine squeezed my hand so hard I thought my fingers might break. Richard proposed 2 months later, more out of duty than love, it seemed, to me. His parents were furious at first, but they eventually accepted the situation with the condition that Richard would still join his father's firm as planned. "We'll need help with the baby," Catherine had told me one evening as she rocked Melissa to sleep. "Just until I finish my degree." Just until turned into 3 years. I moved into a small apartment near them, picking Melissa up from daycare when Catherine had late classes, keeping her overnight when Richard had business dinners. I sang Melissa lullabies, kissed her scraped knees, and read her bedtime stories, until her eyelids grew heavy. When Catherine finally graduated, Richard's career was taking off. They bought their first house in an upscale neighborhood, and suddenly, my daily presence wasn't needed anymore. "We've hired a nanny," Catherine informed me over lunch one day. "She's got excellent references and a degree in early childhood education." "Oh," I'd said, trying to hide my disappointment. "That's wonderful." "You've done so much, Mom," she added, patting my hand. "It's time you had your life back." But Melissa had become my life. Being separated from her felt like losing a limb. Still, I stepped back. I returned to teaching full-time and saw Melissa on scheduled weekend visits. I watched from a distance as Catherine and Richard climbed the social ladder, moving to bigger houses, joining the right clubs, attending the right events. I was invited for holidays and birthdays, always feeling slightly out of place among their new friends, with their perfect clothes and polished conversations about vacations and places I'd never see. I brought homemade gifts because they were meaningful, even as I noticed them being quietly set aside in favor of the expensive store-bought presents from others. Then came the Christmas when Melissa was 7. I'd spent months knitting her a blanket with characters from her favorite storybook. When she opened it, her eyes lit up. "Look, Mommy! It's Princess Luna and the Starlight Kingdom. Grandma made it." Catherine had smiled tightly. "That's nice, dear. Why don't you open the gift? From Daddy and me now?" It was an elaborate dollhouse, nearly as tall as Melissa herself, with electric lights and tiny furniture that probably cost more than my monthly salary. My blanket was forgotten within minutes. That night, after Melissa went to bed, Catherine pulled me aside. "Mom, about the gifts," she began hesitantly. "Richard and I were thinking, perhaps next year you could contribute to something we're already getting her. Something from the list we send to everyone? You want me to chip in on your presents rather than bring my own?" I asked. Confused. It's just that. Well, Melissa is getting to an age where she notices these things. The other kids at her school, their grandparents give them store-bought things, I finished for her. Expensive things. "I didn't mean it like that," she said, but her eyes told a different story. As I sat alone after the wedding, these memories flooded back, each one a piece of evidence I'd overlooked, each one a warning sign I'd chosen to ignore. For years, I'd been slowly but surely pushed to the margins of my own family, yet still, I showed up. When Melissa had chickenpox and both Catherine and Richard were too busy with work, I took a week off to care for her. When Catherine needed emergency gallbladder surgery, I stayed at their house for 10 days, cooking, cleaning, and making sure Melissa's routine wasn't disrupted. When Richard's mother broke her hip and couldn't host their annual Thanksgiving dinner, I opened my modest home to the entire family, spending 2 weeks preparing a meal that Catherine later described as refreshingly rustic. I gave and gave until giving became my identity, until sacrifice became as natural as breathing. And what did it earn me? A seat at table 27, instructions to the photographer to keep me out of the main album, and the knowledge that my own daughter considered me an embarrassment. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as I carefully placed the photos back on the shelf. The house felt too quiet, too empty, too full of ghosts from a past I couldn't reclaim. I went to my desk and pulled out a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "The next chapter," because that's what this would be. Not an ending. I refused to let them write me off so easily. But a beginning. For decades, I had lived for others. Now, it was time to live for myself. My phone began to ring, Catherine's name flashing on the screen. Likely calling to check if I'd gotten home safely, or perhaps to ensure I hadn't made a scene by leaving early. For the first time in my life, I let her call go to voicemail. The small act of rebellion felt like taking my first full breath in years. The morning after the wedding, I woke to 6 missed calls from Catherine and a text message that read, "Mom, where did you go? Richard's parents noticed you were missing during the cake cutting. Call me." "No. Are you okay?" "No. I hope you got home safely. Just concern about appearances, about what Richard's parents might think." I set the phone aside without replying and made myself a cup of strong coffee. As I sat at my kitchen table, watching the early morning light filter through the curtains Edward had hung decades ago, I began to see patterns in Catherine's behavior that I had willfully ignored for years. The wedding seating arrangement wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely the most blatant in a long series of subtle exclusions. 3 months earlier, Catherine had hosted a pre-wedding brunch for Melissa's bridesmaids and close family. I learned about it when Melissa casually mentioned it during one of our phone calls. "Oh, Grandma, the brunch at Mom's was amazing. She had that caterer from New York make those little egg soufflés you love." I'd stammered through a response, pretending I'd been invited but couldn't attend, unwilling to put Melissa in an uncomfortable position. Later, when I asked Catherine about it, she'd been dismissive. "It was very last minute, Mom. And you know how you hate driving in the city. I didn't think you'd want to come all that way just for brunch." Then there was Melissa's college, graduation 2 years before. I'd arranged to take time off work months in advance, only to discover the week before that Catherine had booked only 4 seats at a special graduation dinner at an exclusive restaurant. "It's Richard's parents, us, and Melissa," she'd explained. "The restaurant couldn't accommodate any more at such short notice, but we can meet for coffee before the ceremony." Coffee before the ceremony. as if I were a distant acquaintance, not the woman who had helped raise Melissa during her formative years. And Christmas last year, I'd been invited as usual, but upon arriving, discovered that the family portrait session Catherine had scheduled with a professional photographer was already complete. "Oh, we did that earlier," Catherine had said with a wave of her hand. "Richard had a conference call later, and you know how he gets when he's rushed." The doorbell rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Through the peephole, I saw Catherine standing on my porch, her expression a mix of annoyance and concern. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. This confrontation was inevitable. I needed to establish new boundaries, and that couldn't happen if I avoided her completely. I opened the door but didn't step aside to let her in as I normally would have. "Mom," she said, her voice tight, "why aren't you answering your phone? I've been calling all morning." "I've been busy," I replied simply. She looked taken aback by my tone. "Busy? Doing what? You left the wedding without saying goodbye to anyone. Richard's mother was asking about you." "Was she really?" I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. "Or was she just checking to make sure I hadn't done anything to embarrass you?" Catherine's eyes widened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I think you know exactly what it means, Catherine." I kept my voice calm, even as my heart raced. "I heard you and your friend talking in the office yesterday about how you placed me at table 27 to keep me out of the way, about the photographer's instructions to keep me out of the main album." The color drained from her face. "You were eavesdropping?" "I was walking back from the bathroom and happened to hear my name." "Should I have announced my presence so you could pretend you hadn't just called me an embarrassment?" "What do you want from me, Mom?" she asked, her voice small. It was a question I'd never considered before. What did I want from my daughter? "I want to be treated with basic respect and consideration," I said finally. "I want to be valued for who I am, not hidden away because I don't fit your new image. But more than that, I want to stop putting my life on hold for someone who clearly doesn't appreciate it." Catherine looked stricken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying things are going to change, Catherine. I won't be at your beck and call anymore. I won't rearrange my life to accommodate yours. And I certainly won't show up to be humiliated at family functions." She stared at me as if seeing a stranger. In some ways, perhaps she was. The mother she knew would have backed down by now, would have accepted her half-hearted apology, and returned to the familiar pattern of giving too much and receiving too little. But that woman was gone, left behind at table 27 along with the pearl necklace and the generous check. "I need to go," Catherine said finally, her voice unsteady. "Melissa and Jason are having a post-wedding brunch. Everyone will be wondering where I am." "Of course," I said. "Appearances are important." She flinched, then turned to leave. At the bottom of the porch steps, she paused and looked back. "Will you at least call Melissa? She was upset that you left without saying goodbye." "I'll call her tomorrow," I promised. Today, I have plans of my own. For the first time since Edward died, I felt truly in control of my life. The road ahead was uncertain, perhaps even lonely at times, but it was mine to choose. No longer would I be a footnote in someone else's story. It was time to write my own. After Catherine left, I returned to my notebook and the lists I'd been making. What had started as a cathartic exercise was becoming something more tangible, a blueprint for my new life. A life where I would no longer orbit around Catherine's family like a forgotten satellite. I pulled out my laptop and opened my savings account. The balance wasn't impressive, but it was enough to start with. I'd been saving for years to help Melissa with her wedding, but that money had gone untouched. Now it would serve a different purpose, my own happiness. First, I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community college. Art had been my passion in college before I met Edward, before life's responsibilities pushed my creative pursuits to the sidelines. The course started next Tuesday evening, the same evening I usually watched Melissa's cat when she and Catherine had their monthly spa appointments. they would have to make other arrangements. Next, I booked a trip to the Grand Canyon for the following month. It wasn't Italy. That dream would take more planning. But it was a start. Edward and I had always talked about seeing it together. Now I would go alone, carrying his memory with me in a way that felt right. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Catherine. I read it reluctantly. "Mom, we need to talk about this. Richard thinks you're overreacting." "Can you please call me?" Richard thinks. Of course he does. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I went to my closet and began sorting through my clothes. Most of my wardrobe consisted of practical, unremarkable pieces selected for comfort and durability rather than style. Clothes that wouldn't stand out or draw attention at Campbell family gatherings. Clothes chosen to fade into the background. I pulled out anything I hadn't worn in a year and placed it in a donation pile. By the time I finished, my closet was half empty, but what remained were pieces I genuinely liked. Tomorrow, I would go, shopping for the first time in years without wondering if my choices would meet with Catherine's approval. The doorbell rang again in the late afternoon. This time it was Melissa. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, a stark contrast to the radiant bride of yesterday. Unlike with Catherine, I stepped aside immediately to let her in. "Grandma," she said, her voice breaking. "Why did you leave?" "I was looking everywhere for you after the cake cutting." The hurt in her eyes was genuine, and my resolve wavered. Of all the Campbell family, Melissa was the only one who had ever made me feel truly wanted. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said gently. I wasn't feeling well, and it seemed better to slip out quietly rather than make a fuss. It wasn't the whole truth, but I couldn't bring myself to burden her with my pain, not when she was still glowing from her wedding day. "Mom said you had a fight this morning," she pressed, following me into the kitchen. She was crying when she came to the brunch. I busied myself making tea, buying time to formulate a response that wouldn't place Melissa in the middle. "Your mother and I have some things to work through," I said carefully. "But that's between us. It has nothing to do with you or how much I love you." Melissa sat at the kitchen table, looking around at the stacks of papers and open notebook where I'd been planning my new life. Her eyes lingered on the brochure for the Grand Canyon tour. "You're going on a trip?" she asked, surprise evident, in her voice. "Yes," I replied, setting a mug of tea in front of her. "It's something I've always wanted to do." "By yourself?" "Yes, by myself." She looked troubled by this, though I couldn't quite understand why. "But you've never traveled alone before." "There are a lot of things I've never done before," I said, smiling to soften the words. "It's about time I started, don't you think?" "I guess," she said, still frowning. "It's just, I don't know, different." We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our tea. I could see the questions forming behind her eyes, the confusion as she tried to reconcile the grandmother she knew, always available, always accommodating, with the woman sitting across from her now, booking solo trips and enrolling in art classes. "Grandma," she finally asked, "are you okay? Really okay?" The concern in her voice touched me deeply. Despite everything, despite being raised in a world of privilege and status, Melissa had somehow maintained a genuine heart. "I'm getting there," I answered honestly. "For a long time, I haven't been living my own life. I've been living in the margins of yours and your mother's. It's time I changed that." "Because of what happened at the wedding?" she pressed. I took her hand across the table. "The wedding was just the final piece of a puzzle I've been trying not to see for years. This isn't about punishment, Melissa. It's about me finally taking care of myself the way I've always taken care of everyone else." She nodded slowly, though I could tell she didn't fully understand. How could she? At 26, newly married, with the world at her feet, She couldn't possibly comprehend the quiet desperation of a woman who had surrendered her identity so completely to others that she nearly lost herself entirely. "Will you still come to Sunday dinners?" she asked in a small voice. "Jason and I want to start hosting them at our new place once we're back from the honeymoon." "Of course I will," I assured her, squeezing her hand. "Nothing will change between us. I promise." As I walked her to the door later, she hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandma. More than you know." "I love you too, sweetheart. Always." After she left, I returned to my planning with renewed determination. Seeing Melissa had reminded me of what was still worth fighting for, the genuine connections in my life, stripped of obligation and performance. The phone rang again. Catherine, persistent as always. This time I answered. "Mom, finally," she began, her voice tense. "We need to talk about this." "Not today," I said firmly. "I need some time." "But—" "Goodbye, Catherine." I hung up and turned the ringer off. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own difficult conversations. But tonight belonged to me, to my dreams, my plans, my future. The old Eleanor would have spent the evening worrying about Catherine's feelings, making excuses for her behavior, finding ways to smooth things over. The new Eleanor poured herself a glass of wine, opened a book she'd been meaning to read for months, and allowed herself, perhaps for the first time in decades, to put her own happiness first. It wasn't a dramatic gesture of defiance. There were no slammed doors, no heated ultimatums, just a quiet, firm decision to reclaim my life, one small choice at a time. And somehow that felt more powerful than any grand declaration could have been. 1 month after the wedding, I stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon, watching the sunset paint the ancient rock formations in breathtaking shades of gold and crimson. The vastness before me was humbling, a reminder of how small our human concerns really are against the backdrop of time. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a woman who had positioned her camera tripod near mine. She was about my age, with short silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. "More than I could have imagined," I replied. "First time here?" she asked. "First time anywhere in a long while," I admitted. Her name was Diana, a retired literature professor from Oregon who was traveling across the country by herself, photographing national parks. We exchanged numbers and agreed to meet for dinner that evening. It was the start of my first new friendship in decades. Over plates of Southwestern cuisine, Diana shared stories of her travels, her career, and her late husband. Unlike the strained conversations at Campbell family gatherings, where I always felt like I was being silently assessed, this exchange was easy, natural, and refreshing. "So what finally got you out here?" Diana asked. "You mentioned it's been a while since you've traveled." I found myself telling her about the wedding, about Table 27, about my decision to reclaim my life. There was something liberating about sharing my story with someone who had no preconceptions about me, no stake in the narrative. "Good for you," she said when I finished, raising her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I echoed, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face. My watercolor class had been equally revelatory. After decades away from art, my first attempts were clumsy and uncertain. But there was joy in the process, in watching colors blend and flow across the paper, in creating something purely for my own pleasure, without worrying about anyone else's judgment. The instructor, a gentle man named Marcus with gray dreadlocks and paint-splattered jeans, encouraged experimentation and playfulness over technical perfection. "The goal isn't to create masterpieces," he told the class. "It's to rediscover the part of yourself that creates for the pure joy of it." I had nearly forgotten that joy existed. Years of calculating my worth based on my usefulness to others had dimmed that inner light to almost nothing. But now, stroke by stroke, color by color, it was rekindling. On my return from the Grand Canyon, I found 3 voicemails from Catherine. The first 2 were increasingly frustrated demands that I call her back. The third, left after a week of my silence, was more subdued. "Mom, please call me. I don't understand what's happening. Melissa says you're traveling, taking art classes. We need to talk about this." I did call her back, but on my terms when I was ready. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our homes. Catherine arrived looking harried and defensive. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks," she said accusingly as soon as she sat down. "I needed some time," I replied calmly. "I've been busy." "Busy?" she repeated, as if the concept of me having a life independent of her needs was incomprehensible. "Mom, what's going on with you? First you disappear from the wedding, then you refuse to talk to me? And now Melissa tells me you're traveling alone and taking up painting?" "Yes," I said simply. "I am." "But why? Is this some kind of, I don't know, crisis? Are you punishing me for the seating arrangement? Because if that's what this is about—" "It's not a crisis, Catherine," I interrupted gently. "And it's not about punishment. It's about me finally making myself a priority after decades of putting everyone else first." She stared at me, genuinely perplexed. "I don't understand. What does that even mean?" "It means that I'm no longer available on demand. I have my own life, my own interests, my own plans. I'll still be part of your lives, but on more equal terms." "Equal terms?" she echoed, her voice rising slightly. "Mom, we're family. There aren't terms." "That's precisely the problem," I said. "Family should mean mutual respect and consideration. For years, I've shown up whenever you called, rearranged my schedule to accommodate yours, and accepted being treated as an afterthought. That's changing now." Catherine's expression hardened. "So you are punishing me?" "No, I'm respecting myself. There's a difference." We talked in circles for nearly an hour. Catherine cycling between defensiveness, guilt-tripping, and occasional moments of genuine confusion. I maintained my calm, but held firm to my new boundaries. "I have a yoga class at 6, I finally said, gathering my belongings. "I need to go." "Yoga?" Catherine looked as if I'd said I was leaving for Mars. "Since when do you do yoga?" "Since 2 weeks ago," I replied with a small smile. "I'm enjoying it." As I stood to leave, Catherine reached out and caught my hand. "Mom, please, I don't want to lose you." The vulnerability in her voice touched me. Despite everything, she was still my daughter, the little girl I had raised alone, the center of my world for so many years. "You're not losing me, Catherine," I said softly. "You're just meeting the real me for the first time in a very long time. The me who has her own needs and dreams. The me who deserves to be seen and valued, not hidden away at table 27. I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginnings of understanding. But we both knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight. Years of established patterns couldn't be rewritten in a single conversation. "Sunday dinner at Melissa's next week," she said as I turned to go. "Will you be there?" "I will," I promised. "But I'll be bringing a dessert I want to make, not the one Richard's mother prefers. And I'll be leaving by 8 for a photography class I signed up for." Catherine nodded slowly, still processing this new reality where her mother had boundaries and expectations of her own. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years. The path ahead was still uncertain, the relationship with my daughter, still fragile and in flux. But for the first time, I was walking with my head held high, no longer willing to make myself smaller to fit into the space others had designated for me. I was rediscovering not just old passions, but a new sense of self-worth that had nothing to do with my usefulness to others. Each class I took, each trip I planned, each new friend I made was another piece of myself reclaimed from the shadows. The woman who had sat alone at table 27 was fading away, making room for someone stronger, more authentic, and finally, genuinely, alive. 2 years passed more quickly than I could have imagined. My life, once defined by waiting for Catherine's calls and Melissa's occasional visits, was now rich with activity and purpose. I'd traveled to Italy, finally seeing the canals of Venice and the art of Florence that I'd dreamed about for decades. My watercolors had improved enough that 3 of them were displayed in a local gallery's community exhibition. On a crisp autumn Sunday, I was preparing for one of my now regular dinners with my photography group when my doorbell rang. Catherine stood on my porch, alone and without the usual polished appearance she maintained. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her shoulders slumped. "Mom?" she said, her voice breaking. "I need your help." 2 years ago, I would have immediately dropped everything to solve whatever crisis she was facing. But the woman I had become paused, taking a breath before responding. "Come in," I said. "I have about an hour before I need to leave for dinner with friends." She nodded, accepting this boundary in a way the old Catherine never would have. As we sat in my living room, recently redecorated with artifacts from my travels and paintings from my art classes, she told me about her struggles. Richard had lost a major client at his firm. Their financial situation, while far from dire, was strained enough that they might need to downsize their lavish lifestyle. The country club membership, Melissa's car payments, the vacation house. "We can't maintain everything," she admitted. "And you're here because?" I prompted gently. "Because I don't know how to handle this," she said honestly. "You always managed, even when things were tight. You never crumbled." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. Respect. "I can't solve this for you, Catherine," I said carefully. "But I can listen. I can support you while you figure it out yourself. That's all I'm asking for," she replied, surprising me. "Just be my mom, the way you always were before I started pushing you away." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were still awkward moments, still occasions when old patterns threatened to reemerge, but it was a beginning. Later that month, Melissa invited me to lunch, just the 2 of us. Over salads and iced tea, she reached for my hand. "Grandma, I owe you an apology," she said. "I should have stood up for you at the wedding. I knew what Mom was doing, and I said nothing." "You were the bride, sweetheart. It wasn't your responsibility. Still, I want you to know that I see you, the real you, and I admire you so much for what you've done these past 2 years. As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that the wound of table 27 had finally begun to heal. Not because I had been welcomed back into the fold on their terms, but because I had created a life where their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness. I was Eleanor Holmes, artist, traveler, friend, teacher, mother, grandmother. Every role important, none defining me completely. Table 27 had been meant as an insult, a way to hide me away. Instead, it had become the catalyst for my liberation, and for that, I was unexpectedly, profoundly grateful.